Do you know about Nanjing Massacre or the September 18th incident? If you don't, do you know why you never heard of them? Well, welcome to Facts Tell. I'm Sina. Today, I'll be also joined by Tokyo-based East Asia analyst Professor Bernard Hardy Chartrand from Temple University. Welcome, Professor Hardy.
Thank you very much.
First of all, let's talk about something being trending on the internet. So earlier this month, an American pawn shop owner called Evan Kyle went viral online after posting a video about an album that he believes contains some 30 previous unseen photos related to the Nanjing Massacre. Very brutal things, frankly speaking. Mountains of bodies, beheadings, and various forms of torture. This video got more than 20 million hits and about 66,000 comments. Kyle even said he was caught the next day by a bunch of journalists and spoke to media outlets such as Rolling Stone and Newsweek. There are so many comments also talking about how they'd never heard of it. They were shocked and thankful to see this video. And many believe that the people of Nanjing who went through this tragedy deserve a proper apology. But some netizens still questioned whether the photos are genuine and that they should have been authenticated before being posted online. But Evan himself said the whole purpose of posting the video was to serve as an opportunity to let more people know about this part of history, the mass killing of close to 300,000 Chinese civilians and soldiers by the Imperial Japanese Army in 1937, one of the most barbaric episodes of World War II.
Even if it turns out that these photos are not genuine, this video and what I've done here has educated so many people about what happened in World War II. So many people didn't even know that. I was shocked reading comments like, wow, I never knew. Yeah, Japanese are just as bad as the Nazis. Here's my dilemma personally.
So, Professor Hardy, I'm wondering, how do people in the West perceive Japan's invasion of China? And broadly speaking, what is the general perception internationally of China's war of resistance against Japanese aggression?
I think for a lot of people, the role of China in World War II as a member of the alliance, a member of the Allies, is not exactly as well known as the other members of the Allies, because China in the 1930s and the 1940s, although it was part of the alliance, was obviously not as powerful as, let's say, the UK, the England and the United States and other allies in Europe. So for that reason, very often, I think, especially from a Western perspective, there tends to be a little bit of an overlooking of the role, very important role that China played here in this region in East Asia in order to fight against fascism.
So when it comes to World War II, many people know about Hitler and Nazi Germany, the genocide of Jews, the Holocaust, and the brutal killings inside the concentration camps. And they think the whole thing began with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. But nearly 8 years prior, on September 18, 1931, the Imperial Japanese Army suddenly attacked Shenyang and occupied northeast China by force, in an event known in China as the September 18th incident, or as the Magda incident in the West. Here's the footage I want to share with you guys.
When the Imperial Japanese government invaded Manchuria and occupied vast lands in the northeast, which are now China's Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning provinces. Some 45 million casualties were recorded. Most took place during the last 8 years of the war as a direct result of a Japanese war policy known as Blunder, Kill, and Burn. The policy was fully put to use on December 13, 1937, when the Japanese army seized the city of Nanjing, the then capital of the Republic of China. The Chiang Kai-shek government had decided to make a strategic retreat a few days before. Nanjing was left wide open for what later became one of the most atrocious war crimes in human history. According to the final ruling of the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal in 1947, more than 300,000 people were massacred in the span of 6 weeks. Over 200,000 women were raped, tortured, and killed. Thousands more were forced to become sex slaves to the Japanese army. The Japanese government to this day has yet to make an official apology to the families of the victims, despite the fact that dozens of mass graves have been discovered over the decades. In 1998, The remains of 208 people were recovered from a mass grave of only 40 cubic meters.
So the September 18th incident marked the challenge of fascist countries to the international order, the prelude to World War II, and the beginning of Japan's invasion of China. And to some extent, China fired the first shot against fascism in the East. So Professor Hardy, what do people understand about that outside Asia?
I think this is, unfortunately, a relatively unknown part of history, because when people think about World War II, they usually think about what happened starting in 1939, right? Because this is the official start of the war. When we think about the global or World War II, right, it's 1939 to 1945. For that reason, I think a lot of people tend to ignore or overlook some of the events that led to World War II. And of course, that here we're talking about the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931. We're talking also about the full-scale invasion that started in 1937, but also other pre-war events, including some events that started in Africa and Ethiopia, for example. The way that we look at history in the West simply tends to overlook some of the most important events.
So sadly, China wasn't Japan's only victim. During World War II, Japan waged war against several countries in the Asia Pacific. The Japanese comfort women system brought untold suffering to many people.
Women with faces full of fear are lined up against a wall. A man presumed to be a Chinese officer talks to them. This short 18-second video is of 7 Korean women sexually enslaved by the Japanese soldiers in Yunnan province, southwest of China, around the end of World War II. It is the first ever video footage of Korean victims that has been found.
But not just women, men, the elderly, children, and infants all became so-called study subjects of Unit 731, which conducted human experiments on them.
Died at its hands, as it conducted human experiments on both captured civilians and military officers, ranging from Chinese and Koreans to Mongolians and Russians. One of their most infamous experiments were called vivisections, where prisoners were dissected alive, usually without anesthesia, to study the effects of various procedures or diseases, such as amputations or gangrene. The infected and vivisected prisoners included pregnant women, the elderly, children, and infants.
But despite the enormity of the atrocities committed by the Japanese military, many young people living in Japan know little about them. This is a young Japanese man's reaction when he first heard about what Unit 731 did.
Moving on from there, many victims had all or part of their organs removed, and some even had organs detached, then reattached in unique ways nature never intended. Experiments were also conducted with high pressure, poisonous chemical exposure, centrifuges, burning, blood infusions from animals, burying, and x-rays. Of course, since the purpose of these tests was to determine how much a body could withstand, the experiments would generally continue until the test subject was dead.
I didn't know the details at all. It was more shocking than I expected.
Given all of this, it may or may not surprise you to hear from people raised in Japan that they hardly learned 20th century Japanese history in class. For example, in a BBC report from 2013, it is noted that one major Japanese school's history book contains only 19 out of 357 pages dealing with events between 1931 and 1945, with, for example, the Nanjing Massacre occupying only one line.
The Nanjing Massacre occupied only one line in the Japanese textbook. But that one line bears the murders of hundreds of thousands of people and the rapes of thousands of women within 6 weeks. We know that the Japanese military committed many atrocities during World War II, such as the plunder, kill, and burn policy conducted against Chinese civilians, Unit 731 and its human experiments, sex slavery, chemical warfare, and not to mention the Nanjing Massacre. So, Professor Hardy, I know you can read Japanese. Do you think that Japanese textbooks properly reflect or emphasize Japan's wartime acts?
Yeah, that's a great question. The textbook issues has long been an area of controversy between China and Japan, but also between South Korea and Japan. These textbook issues really started in the The first real controversy happened in 1982. There's been a series of other textbook controversies that occurred since the 1990s, which led to several large-scale protests in Chinese cities regarding what they perceived as this real lack of sensitivity in Japan towards the suffering of the Chinese people. To give you an example, in one of those cases, I think it was in the early 2000s, the Ministry of Education requested that one of these books, because one thing we have to understand is there are a large variety of history books. There is not one single book for the whole of Japan, but the Japanese Ministry of Education requested that one of these books change the word invasion of China to the word advance in China.
And even beyond Asia, Japan is trying to erase these crimes and distort history. Let's hear from Howard Bergbauer, a 94-year-old World War II veteran from the U.S.
The Japanese were pretty brutal against the Chinese people. They keep denying things that went on, I guess. They even, I've heard that they've even, was our fault to start the war, that we started the war. Instead of the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, they don't say too much about that.
So this is how Japan played a victim card and avoided taking responsibilities. What are the reasons, Professor Hardy, for Japan's reluctance to face up and reflect on its own history?
Yeah, that's also a very good and important question. So to kind of give a broader picture of the whole situation, there have been historically many official apologies that have been given by the Japanese government, including by the emperor. Now, some of these apologies were quite general, quite broad, without specifically mentioning some of the things that happened in China. To give you a sense of the history a little bit, the very first prime minister of Japan that gave an apology was Prime Minister Tanaka in 1972. The Emperor Akihito as well made an apology. There was one more recently by the new Emperor Naruhito. But then again, the emperor's apology tended to be quite general, quite broad, rather than referring to certain issues. So here's the thing. There have been a good number of apologies, but at the same time, the issue is you often have other politicians in Japan that say certain things that tend to, or that seem like they are walking back on these previous apologies.
So yeah, talking about Japanese leaders, some of them regularly visit or send ritual offerings to Yasukuni Shrine. Enbei did, Suga did, even Kishida has sent a ritual offering before. But we know that this shrine honors 14 convicted Class A Japanese war criminals from World War II and is deemed by neighboring countries as a symbol of Japan's past in militarism. What does it mean for Japanese leaders to visit the shrine, despite the outcry of its neighboring countries?
Prime Minister Kishida, which you mentioned earlier, sent offerings to the shrine. It's also important to understand that these politicians in Japan, the prime ministers, they're under a lot of pressure, especially from conservatives, to visit that shrine, because even though they probably wish that those 14 war criminals were not enshrined there, they still feel the need, the political and personal need to pay homage, pay tribute to the millions of people who have died in the service of Japan.
Well, some scholars also argue that the U.S. led the post-war settlements in Asia, such as the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal and the Treaty of San Francisco, were inadequate in addressing atrocities committed by Japan. For example, the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951 expunged Japan's obligations to pay reparations for its wartime acts. But neither Republic of Korea nor China were party to the treaty. This seems a bit unequal and unfair to the Asian populations who suffered during World War II. Professor Hardy, what is your take on this?
Well, yes, indeed, there are some issues that continue to be recognized with regard to the San Francisco Peace Treaty. Of course, one of the big issues, as you mentioned, is that China and Korea did not sign this treaty. The Soviet Union also did not sign this treaty. So it is perceived by many as being an incomplete conclusion to World War II.
Even to this day, some people are still trying to deny the very existence of Nanjing Massacre. Japanese right-wingers have sent death threats to individuals who want to reveal the truth. For example, the author of The Rape of Nanking, Chinese-American writer Iris Chan, received all kinds of threats. Her book did somehow change Western society's perception of Asian battlefields during World War II. However, she succumbed to the pressure and committed suicide. So, Professor Hardy, is this also something that stops people from revealing the truth in the English-speaking world?
That's a very good and complicated question. Of course, the case of Iris Chang is a great tragedy, of course, to have such a young woman commit suicide. Partially, or at least, it's understood that it was partially a result of the pressure that she was under and some of the threats as well that she faced. You were talking about the threats that she received from right-wingers, and as well as the denials. One thing that needs to be said is it is absolutely, of course, true that you have a small portion in Japan of the people who tend to who want to deny things like the Nanjing Massacre. I've seen some of these people myself at the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, but these remain a very small portion of Japanese society. Some of the most extreme elements of the conservative blocs in Japan. It is certainly not the view of the mainstream in Japanese society. The overwhelming majority of Japanese people are aware, even though they might lack some of the details or not know everything, they're certainly aware of the aggression that Japan committed before World War II.
Certainly, I'm sure they are. And we know that this year marks the 91st anniversary of September 18th incident. So back to the trending video at the beginning, Professor Hardy, why there are so many people outside Asia unaware of Nanjing Massacre and September 18th incident? What is your explanation?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think it is enough known. We have to put things in perspective. Although these are obviously very dark events of World War II and pre-World War II that I believe should be much more widely known, not only here in Japan, but also in the West, if you look at the education system in the West, obviously, and including myself, when I grew up in Canada and I learned about World War II, most of the focus was on the European theater of war. Of course, we heard a little bit about the what happened in the Pacific, in Asia Pacific as well, but certainly not to the extent of the events that happened in Europe. So for that reason, things like the Nanjing Massacre, things like the September 18 incidents, and other things related to World War II simply kind of tended to fly a little bit under the radar.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hardy, for your time. As one of the major international events of the 20th century, September 18th incident triggered not only a war between China and Japan, but also a catastrophe that eventually spanned the Pacific and echoed the battlefields of Europe. World War II was an unprecedented disaster that affected more than 60 countries and regions and involved 3/4 of the world's population. It can be said that September 18th incident was not only the cause of the Sino-Japanese War, but also the prelude of World War II. From this perspective, the September 18th incident in China is no different from the attack on Pearl Harbor. The North Camp of China's Northeastern Army was flattened by heavy artillery bombardments, just like the USS Arizona was hit by Japanese torpedo bombers, and now sits at the bottom of the ocean. For a long time, the Western world's record of crimes committed by Japan's militaries have been much less than that of Hitler's atrocity, which are widely known. Yet the losses of China and many Asian countries are not given the same evaluation and status they deserve. But let's at least not forget what has happened. Remember the very beginning of the world's anti-fascist war in the East and reflect on the history so that it won't repeat itself. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. If you like our show, please click like and subscribe, and also leave your comments down below. We'd like to hear what you think. I'm Sina. I'll see you guys next time.